Hi there, this is Andy from Blessed Man Meditations. Recently, Alex O'Connor from Cosmic Skeptic posted a video containing about 40 arguments for atheism. I have no personal vindictive vendetta against Alex or against any other atheist. I love Alex, and I love all atheists as my fellow people, all created in God's image. But I believe their epistemology is wrong and needs to be responded to. This video will be part of a lengthy series I plan to do in response to each argument Alex makes. So please like this video, comment, and please subscribe. I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.
A new, fast-growing Christian YouTube channel, Redeemed Zoomer, put out a video promisingly called All Atheist Arguments Answered in 10 Minutes. Let's see how he does.
Atheists have a lot of
That they never misquote Jesus.
Jesus never claimed to be God. Yes, he did. He didn't say, I am God, worship me, but he showed that he was God in many places in all four Gospels by doing things that only God can do. It's true that he didn't walk around before his resurrection claiming to be God, because he wanted people to figure it out themselves. That's why he kept saying, who do you say that I am? However, after his resurrection, people figured out that he was God, and Jesus congratulated them.
That's why he kept saying, who do you say I am? Doesn't he say that just, once? More subtle hyperbole, perhaps. Anyway, did Jesus claim to be God? I have a whole podcast about this with Bart Ehrman. It's a really interesting one if you don't mind a bit of self-promo. But the long and short of it is that Jesus definitely seems to claim to be God in John's Gospel, but maybe not so much in the Synoptics. But you've just put some examples on the screen from the Synoptic Gospels, so let's take a look at one of them. You've identified forgiving sins as something that only God can do. I wouldn't be so sure. Take a look at John chapter 20, verse 21 onwards. Jesus is speaking here to his disciples after the resurrection. Again, Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." And with that, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, their sins are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." So the apostles had the power to forgive sins. This is clearly the gospel showing that the apostles are all God, right? Because forgiving sins is something that only God can do. Obviously not. Maybe you'll say something like, well, they could forgive sins because Jesus gave them that power, but it's still Jesus' power, really. But take notice, Jesus said to them, "As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." So if Jesus sending the disciples to forgive sins doesn't make them gods, then the Father sending Jesus to forgive sins doesn't make him God either. I could go on for ages about this, but watch my podcast with Bart Ehrman.
Thank you for joining me today on Blessed Man Meditations. Today we continue going through Alex's video, Every Argument for Atheism, and formulating responses to that video. In one of his arguments, Alex asked the question, did Jesus really claim to be God? And Alex said that he asked, did Jesus really ask people to correctly identify him as Messiah? Or did he just ask that once? Did Jesus really claim to be God? Alex says Jesus definitely claims to be God in John's Gospel, but not so much in the Synoptics, and that's the portion I really want to address with this video. Alex says if Jesus sending out the disciples and giving them authority to forgive sins doesn't make the disciples God, then the Father sending out Jesus and giving Jesus authority to forgive sins doesn't make Jesus God either. Now, I'm not addressing that part of Alex's statement in this video. Perhaps I can do that in a subsequent video. I'm addressing Alex's first statement, that Jesus doesn't claim to be God much at all in the Synoptic Gospels. So let's respond to Alex by going through the Gospels to see if any of the Synoptics contain statements or actions in which Jesus demonstrates a claim to be God. First, let's look at Matthew 7:24-29, where we see that Jesus spoke authoritative words. In this passage, he says that those who hear and do his word are like wise people and who can withstand anything that life will throw at them. In contrast, anyone who hears and does not obey Jesus is foolish, and their fall will be great. So Jesus spoke with authoritative words. In this passage, Jesus says his word comes with ultimate authority. If someone's going to think about what a God would be like, wouldn't it make sense for that God, whoever he or she or it is, to claim for himself, herself, or itself ultimate authority. Shouldn't God, if such a God exists, shouldn't God claim ultimate authority for him, her, or itself? This is one passage of multiple where Jesus claims such authority for himself. Jesus claims to be God in this passage by saying that no authority is greater than his, and that all people would be wise to follow him, and all people would be foolish not to follow him. By making this claim, Jesus is either demonstrating insanity or deity. In each of the Synoptic Gospels, we see multiple attestation of healing from leprosy, which involved losing feeling from one's extremities caused by a bacterial infection. This would cause those affected by it to rub their extremities off over time. This left people ceremonially unclean and cut off from society. Jesus healed multiple lepers so they could re-enter society. If Jesus says and demonstrates such authority by performing the healings, and if these are the types of acts repeated by multiple gospel authors, it seems to be a demonstration of powers that should be unique to a deity, multiply attested powers. Matthew and Luke both demonstrate authority over disease in healing from paralysis and imminent death. This passage recounts the healing of a centurion's servant. So he shows authority over disease and the healing of a centurion's servant, another multiply attested miracle. Matthew, Mark, and Luke demonstrate Jesus' authority over disease and spirits when Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law of a fever disease that left her bedridden. Matthew, Mark, and Luke demonstrate Jesus' authority over disease and spirits in a healing of someone. Matthew, Mark, and Luke demonstrate Jesus' authority over nature when Jesus stops the stormy seas for the disciples. If he demonstrates such authority over the laws of nature and these types of acts are repeated by multiple gospel authors, this seems to be a demonstration of powers that should be unique to a deity. In Matthew and Mark, he demonstrates authority over demons when he healed 2 demon-possessed men. In such a passage, he demonstrates authority over the spiritual realm, and if these types of acts are repeated by multiple gospel authors, this seems to be a demonstration of powers that should be unique to a deity. Next, in Matthew and Mark, he demonstrates the authority to forgive sins when he heals the paralytic. First, he declares him forgiven, and then he demonstrates his authority to forgive by demonstrating his power to heal. If he demonstrates the prerogative to forgive, and these are the types of acts that are repeated by multiple gospel authors, that seems to be a demonstration of powers that should be unique to a deity. In addition, if he demonstrates the authority to forgive by first demonstrating the power to heal, then such demonstrations should be unique to a deity. So he demonstrates authoritative words, authority over disease, authority over spirits and demons, authority over nature, authority to forgive sins, more. Jesus demonstrated that he is God by demonstrating authority over spiritual acts. In this passage, in Matthew and Mark, he teaches about fasting. He teaches the disciples of John the Baptist that there was no need for them to fast, because people fast when they are looking to enhance a connection with God who is distant. But because Jesus is God in their midst, they had no need to fast because God was present with them. They would need to fast when he was taken from them, when he was killed. Fasting is done to hear more specifically from God. There was no need to do so for John the Baptist's disciples at that time because Jesus, as God, was present. So Jesus claimed to be God in teaching them they did not need to fast. Next, Jesus claimed to be God in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, by demonstrating authority over death when he raised the ruler's dead daughter back to life. If Jesus says and demonstrates the prerogative to raise the dead, and if these are the types of acts that are repeated by multiple gospel authors, synoptic gospel authors, that seems to be a demonstration of powers that should be unique to a deity. So contrary to what Alex said, that Jesus did not claim to be God as much in the Synoptics, we can see from examples such as these that he claimed to be God through powerful demonstrations throughout the Synoptic Gospels. Next, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus demonstrated authority over disease when he healed the woman with the issue of blood. If he demonstrates authority by performing healing, such as healing the woman with the issue of blood, and these types of acts are repeated by multiple gospel authors, in this case they're repeated by each of the synoptic gospels, that seems to be a demonstration of powers that should be unique to a deity. So Jesus demonstrated authority over disease again. Again, Jesus demonstrating authority over disease when he heals two blind men of their blindness. If he demonstrates such authority by performing the healings, and these are the types of acts that are repeated by multiple gospel authors, that seems to be a demonstration of powers that should be unique to a deity. Next, he demonstrates authority over disease and of the spiritual realm. Jesus healing a demon-possessed mute man performs the healing and deliverance from the demons, and if these types of acts are repeated by multiple gospel authors, it seems to be a demonstration that should be unique to a deity. Deliverance from demons did happen in multiple gospels. This particular episode seems to be unique to Matthew. Matthew chapter 7 is an example of Jesus demonstrating his deity by supporting his authoritative words with powerful acts. He gave this testimony to John the Baptist, saying that the works that he did demonstrated that he is the Messiah. He called John to infer from his works that he's the Messiah. If Jesus says and demonstrates such authority by performing healings, deliverance from demons, and other things, and these things are the types of acts that are repeated by multiple gospel authors, that seems to be a demonstration of powers that should be unique to a deity. So he did powerful acts to support his words. If he says and demonstrates such authority, power, and sovereignty, and if these types of acts are repeated by multiple gospel authors, that seems to be a demonstration of deity. For him to refer to himself as Messiah would be insane for him to do unless it were true. Could an insane person perform the works that he performed and validate his words if he were not the Messiah? But Jesus did powerful works to validate his words. Matthew chapter 11, verses 20 to 24. Jesus pronounced judgment on those who reject Christ as Messiah. He pronounced divine judgment on regions who witnessed his miracles and his claim to deity, but yet rejected him as their Lord and Messiah. After performing such obvious miracles, the people who rejected him despite irrefutable evidence of his true identity. They had enough evidence to see who he was. He rightfully pronounced divine judgment on them because they proved that there was no amount of evidence that he could give them that would cause them to believe in him, because it was not about the evidence, it was about the condition of their hearts, as it is with many unbelievers today. So what right did Jesus have to pronounce such divine judgment unless he spoke on behalf of God, unless he claimed to be God? In the passage about being the Lord of the Sabbath, repeated in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, each of the synoptic gospels, Jesus declares he has more authority than the law that God gave people. If the law came from God but is not equal to God, and Jesus is greater than the law, then Jesus is making a claim to be equal with God. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus did powerful actions to authenticate the powerful statement that he is Lord of the Sabbath. He demonstrated divine verbal authority by demonstrating healing power on the Sabbath. In Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all three synoptic gospels plus John, Jesus demonstrates creative power by feeding 5,000 men plus women and children. He demonstrates his power to create, like God created in Genesis 1 when he creates enough food from 5 loaves and 2 fish to feed 5,000 men plus women plus children. Look at the list we're compiling of the ways that Jesus is claiming to be God in the synoptic gospels at the bottom there. In Matthew, Mark, two of the Synoptic Gospels, and John, Jesus demonstrates his power and authority over the laws of nature by walking on water and making wind stop in the storm with the disciples. In Matthew chapter 14, Jesus accepted worship. By accepting worship, he demonstrated his identity as God by accepting worship from people that should only be directed to God. By not refusing worship, he shows he deserves worship that should only be directed to God. His works leading up to this demonstrate that he is worthy of such worship. So Jesus accepted worship that should only be directed to God, and he shows that he is deserving of that worship. He did works to back up the claim that he's deserving of worship. Next, each of the, Matthew and Mark at least demonstrates Jesus' power and authority to heal. And these powers are demonstrations that should be unique to a deity. Matthew and Mark include the feeding of the 4,000, where Jesus demonstrates his power to create like God created in Genesis 1. In Mark chapter 8, Jesus healed a blind man. He demonstrated his authority and power over disease by healing a blind man. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he demonstrated his predictive power by predicting his own death and resurrection on multiple occasions. In Matthew and Mark, Jesus demonstrated his supremacy to the law and prophets. At the Transfiguration, when the voice the disciples heard told them to listen to Jesus supremely above the law and prophets. So, at the Transfiguration, multiply attested by Matthew and Mark, Jesus is receiving support of his divine claim to be God by the hearing of the voice of God the Father himself. Matthew, Mark, and Luke share the demonstration of the authority of disease when Jesus healed an epileptic boy. If he says and demonstrates such authority by performing the healings. And if these types of acts are repeated by multiple gospel authors, that seems to be a demonstration of powers that should be unique to a deity. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus predicts his own death and resurrection. This is a statement demonstrating his claim to be God, and then he backed it up by actually performing the resurrection. Did it again, later in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, predicting his own death and resurrection. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we see the healing of blind Bartimaeus. If he demonstrates such authority by performing the healings, and if these types of acts are repeated by multiple gospel authors, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it seems that the demonstration of power should be unique to a deity. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they record the triumphal entry. He demonstrates his identity as God by accepting worship from people that should only be directed to God. By not refusing the worship, he shows that he deserves it. Matthew, Mark, and Luke show Jesus' authority to pronounce the temple practices as unethical. He demonstrates his identity as God by exercising ultimate moral authority and cleansing the temple because of the unethical practices that were being tolerated in the temple. In Matthew and Mark, Jesus demonstrated the authority and power to curse and pronounce judgment on Israel. He demonstrated his prerogative as judge, as God judges, in cursing the fig tree and causing it to wither away as an object lesson. In Matthew 24, 1 and 2, he demonstrated his predictive power when he predicted the events of 70 AD, 40 years before the events even took place. In Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Jesus predicted Peter's denials before they happened. In Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Jesus predicted Judas's betrayal before it happened. In Matthew 28, 9 and 10, Jesus demonstrates his deity by accepting worship that he and others know should only be directed towards God. Getting closer to the end, Jesus demonstrated that he had a superior moral standard, where he taught that not only our actions are judged, but our thoughts and intents are also judged in the Sermon on the Mount. In Mark chapter 1, God the Father demonstrates Jesus' deity by expressing that he is pleased with Christ. This is significant because God the Father could not say this about anyone else because of the sinfulness of all the human race. So God is pleased with Christ because he's not sinful, because he's God. Matthew 15 and Mark 7, Jesus delivered the Syrophoenician's daughter from demonic possession. He demonstrated his power and authority over the spiritual realm in doing so. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he demonstrated authority over demons, where Luke agrees with the other synoptic writers that Jesus cast out demons. In doing so, he demonstrated authority over the spiritual realm, something we would expect to find in a deity. In Mark, when Jesus healed the deaf and mute man, he demonstrated his authority and power over disease. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus demonstrated a superior moral standard when he taught on the importance of humility and service, superior moral virtues. He expounded a superior moral standard by teaching about the importance of humility rather than pride and serving others rather than being served by others. In Matthew and Mark, he taught about the superior moral standard in marriage. He expounded a superior moral standard, including teaching about marriage and divorce and how marriage should be between one man and one woman for life. Each of the four gospel authors recorded about the resurrection, and they say he accomplished his own resurrection from the dead. Not only do we have four gospel writers giving multiple attestation to this, we have the rest of the New Testament further expounding it, and we have the Old Testament predicting it. So in conclusion, for at least the following 16 reasons, Jesus claimed to be God in the Synoptic Gospels. He spoke with authoritative words. He demonstrated authority over disease. He demonstrated authority over spirits and demons. He demonstrated authority over nature. He demonstrated the authority to forgive sins. He demonstrated the authority over spiritual acts. He demonstrated the authority over death. He performed powerful acts to support his words. He demonstrated the authority to pronounce divine judgment. He demonstrated superiority to the law. He demonstrated creative power. He accepted worship. He demonstrated predictive power. He demonstrated supremacy to the law and prophets. He demonstrated a superior moral standard. And he rose from the dead. In the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus repeatedly acted in multiply attested ways that demonstrated that he claimed to be God and backed up that claim with demonstrations of his power. For the above reasons, Alex is mistaken when he says that Jesus did not claim to be God much in the Synoptic Gospels. So thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.